My name is Michael Anderson, and I am a 52-year-old former firefighter turned pastor in Dallas, Texas. What I'm about to share with you is my near-death experience and the life-altering revelation I received about fasting, prayer, and the spiritual realm. What I witnessed during those moments will forever change how I approach my faith, and I believe it will do the same for you. It happened on October 5th, 2023, during the 12th day of a water-only fast, a fast I had been deeply led into through prayer. Fasting had always been part of my spiritual life, but this time it felt different. There was an unexplainable spiritual weight to it, as if I were being prepared for something beyond my understanding. That morning at 5:45 a.m., I was driving to our church's early morning prayer service. The streets were empty, and an unusual autumn rain fell over Dallas, making everything feel eerily peaceful. I had worship music playing softly in the background and was deep in prayer, feeling closer to God than ever before. Then in a split second, everything changed. A speeding semi-truck ran a red light and crashed directly into the driver's side of my car. The impact was devastating. Later, I would learn that I had suffered severe internal injuries, multiple organ failures, and that my heart had stopped for exactly 17 minutes and 23 seconds. But what happened during those 17 minutes was more real than anything I had ever experienced in my 52 years of life. One moment I was trapped in my crushed car, and the next, I was floating above the scene, watching everything unfold with absolute clarity. I could see the paramedics working frantically, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and even the stunned truck driver sitting on the curb with his head in his hands. And then, the world around me began to fade, and I was pulled into something beyond this life. As I was pulled upward, I felt a peace unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just an absence of pain. It was a deep, overwhelming sense of love and belonging. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't confused. Instead, I felt more alive than I ever had in my earthly body. Then I noticed something extraordinary. Golden threads of light stretched from the earth below, reaching into the heavens. These were not random. They were spiritual pathways connecting specific individuals to something far greater. I instinctively knew that these glowing strands represented prayers and fasting, acts of faith that were actively bridging the gap between the physical and spiritual realms. As I marveled at this sight, I heard a voice, powerful yet filled with love. "Michael, I have brought you here to show you what many do not yet understand." I turned, and standing before me was Jesus. Though I had never seen him face to face before, I knew instantly who he was. His presence radiated authority, yet his gaze held a love so deep that it undid me to my core. He lifted his hand, and suddenly I saw how fasting impacts the spiritual atmosphere. It was as if a thick, dark veil covered the earth, but wherever someone fasted with a sincere heart, that veil was torn open, allowing light from heaven to break through. The more committed the fast, the larger and brighter the opening. Then he spoke again. "Many of my children do not understand the power they hold through fasting. When you fast, you are not just denying yourself. You are creating a channel for heaven's power to move on earth." At that moment, I realized that fasting was far more than a religious discipline. It was a spiritual weapon, one that could shift atmospheres, bring breakthroughs, and strengthen our connection to God like nothing else. As I stood there, still trying to grasp what I was seeing, Jesus lifted his hand once more, and suddenly, history unfolded before my eyes. I wasn't just watching these events, I was witnessing them as if I were there, standing in the very moments they happened. The first thing I saw was Moses on Mount Sinai. He had been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, his body weak, but his spirit fully alive. I watched as the glory of God descended upon the mountain, the atmosphere around him shimmering with divine presence. Then I understood. Moses' fasting had created a spiritual opening, allowing him to receive the 10 Commandments directly from God. Without fasting, the spiritual atmosphere would not have been prepared for such a revelation. Then the vision shifted, and I saw Daniel in Babylon kneeling in prayer. He had been fasting for 21 days, denying himself all rich foods. I watched as, in the unseen realm, dark forces tried to block the answer to his prayers, but his fasting weakened the demonic resistance, allowing the angelic messenger to finally break through. It was then that I realized fasting doesn't just align us with God, it actively pushes back spiritual opposition. I was then shown countless believers throughout history, some famous, some completely unknown. I saw early Christians fasting before major decisions. I saw revivalists fasting before great moves of God. And I saw ordinary people, forgotten by history, whose fasting had changed the course of entire nations. Then Jesus looked at me with deep intensity and said, "My church is entering a time where fasting will no longer be optional. It is a key to the battles ahead." I felt the weight of those words. This wasn't just about personal spiritual growth. This was about preparing for something far greater. What I was witnessing wasn't just about past events. It was a call to action for the present and the future. Fasting had shaped history, and now it would be critical for what was to come. As Jesus' words echoed in my spirit, the vision shifted once again. This time I was shown the days ahead, a future that felt closer than I wanted to believe. I saw the earth covered in a dense, heavy darkness, pressing down over cities and nations. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. A spiritual oppression so thick it seemed to choke the very air. Then, piercing through the darkness, I saw beams of light, just like the golden threads I had seen earlier. But these weren't just individual prayers, they were corporate fasts, entire groups of believers coming together in unity to seek God. As they fasted, the darkness began to weaken, breaking apart in certain areas. Their fasting wasn't just personal, it was warfare. Jesus turned to me and said, "The battles ahead cannot be won through prayer alone. Fasting must be restored to its rightful place in my church." I saw spiritual strongholds, demonic forces entrenched over regions, and how corporate fasting created powerful waves of spiritual force that pushed back the darkness. These waves didn't just affect individuals, they shifted entire atmospheres, bringing breakthroughs in families, cities, and even nations. But there was also a warning. Jesus showed me that many in the church had neglected fasting, treating it as an optional spiritual discipline rather than the weapon of war that it truly is. I saw churches struggling, leaders falling, believers battling unseen forces without their full armor, and the enemy taking advantage of their spiritual weakness. Then Jesus spoke again, his voice filled with urgency. "Tell them, my people must prepare. Fasting is not just for the past, it is for what is coming. Those who understand this will walk in greater power, but those who ignore it will struggle in ways they were never meant to." At that moment, I understood. Fasting was not just personal devotion. It was strategic preparation for the greatest spiritual battles of our time. As I stood in awe of what I was witnessing, Jesus turned to me once more, and suddenly I saw countless people fasting across different time periods and cultures. Some were kneeling in prayer, their faces filled with devotion. Others fasted out of obligation, their hearts disconnected from the true purpose. And then There were those who fasted only for show, hoping to appear spiritual in front of others. Jesus looked at me with sadness in his eyes and said, "Not all fasting carries the same weight in the spiritual realm." I was then shown 3 distinct types of fasting and their spiritual effects. Fasting for show, no power. I saw people who fasted publicly, making sure everyone knew about their sacrifice. But their fasting created no spiritual impact. It was like sending up empty smoke that quickly faded. They seek recognition from others, and that is the only reward they will receive, Jesus said solemnly. Religious obligation, little power. Then I saw others who fasted because they were taught it was the right thing to do, but their hearts were not fully engaged. Their fasting produced some effect, but it was weak and inconsistent. Jesus explained that without true surrender, fasting becomes an empty ritual rather than a spiritual breakthrough. Fasting with humility and surrender and great power. Finally, I saw those who fasted with genuine hunger for God, deep repentance, and a desire to align with His will. Their fasting created massive openings in the spiritual realm, allowing waves of God's power to flow there with them. This kind of fasting shifted destinies, brought breakthroughs, and unleashed heaven's authority on earth. Then Jesus looked at me with deep love and said, "Fasting is not about earning my favor. You already have my love. It is about positioning yourself to receive what I am ready to release." At that moment, I realized the true power of fasting is not in the act itself, but in the heart behind it. After showing me the different types of fasting, Jesus turned to me again, and suddenly, I saw a vast battlefield stretching across the earth. It was not a physical war, but a spiritual one. Angels and demons clashing, unseen by human eyes. Some believers stood strong, fully armored, wielding weapons of light. Others looked weak and unprotected, their armor broken or missing entirely. Then I saw something incredible. Whenever someone fasted with a pure heart, their armor became stronger, their weapons sharper, and their prayers more precise and powerful. Their fasting wasn't just a personal act. It was a strategic move in spiritual warfare. Jesus spoke with authority. Many of my children do not realize that fasting strengthens their spiritual defenses. When you fast, you're not just denying the flesh. You are fortifying your spirit for battle. I watched as believers engaged in prayer while fasting. Their words became like arrows of fire, striking demonic forces with supernatural accuracy. I saw strongholds that had existed for generations beginning to crack and crumble, addictions breaking, families being restored, and cities experiencing spiritual awakening. But then, I saw the enemy's counterattack. The moment someone began a fast, demons launched distractions, temptations, and physical challenges to make them quit. Some believers, unaware of the enemy's tactics, gave in too easily, abandoning their fast before the breakthrough could come. Jesus looked at me and said, "Protection during fasting is crucial. Stay under my covering. Saturate yourself in my word. Surround yourself with prayer, and do not rely on your own strength." At that moment, I understood. Fasting is not just about seeking God, it is about engaging in spiritual warfare. The enemy knows its power, which is why he fights so hard to stop it. But those who endure will walk in greater authority and victory. As I stood in the presence of Jesus, the battlefield before me faded, and a new vision appeared. I saw believers who had committed to fasting regularly, not just for a breakthrough, but as a lifestyle. These individuals shined with an inner strength, their spiritual senses sharpened in a way that was unlike anything I had seen before. Jesus turned to me and said, "Fasting is not just for warfare. It is also for transformation. When my children fast with the right heart, they do not leave the same. Their spirits are strengthened, their discernment increases, and they begin to walk in a level of spiritual authority they never knew was possible." At that moment, I was shown how fasting upgrades our spiritual senses. I saw a man who had fasted for 21 days, and when he prayed after his fast, it was as if his words carried weight in the spiritual realm. His prayers were no longer weak or uncertain. They carried authority, piercing through the darkness with ease. Then I saw another incredible truth. Extended fasting creates new spiritual pathways within a person, almost like a map of light forming in their soul. These pathways allowed them to operate with greater clarity, receive deeper revelation, and walk in step with the Holy Spirit in ways they never had before. Jesus then showed me spiritual reservoirs, storehouses filled with what looked like living water. He explained, "Those who develop a lifestyle of fasting are storing up spiritual strength for the battles they don't even know are coming. In times of trial, they will not be empty. They will draw from the reservoirs they have built through their sacrifice." At that moment, I understood. Fasting is not just about seeking God for a momentary breakthrough. It is about long-term spiritual growth. Those who embrace it will find themselves prepared for whatever is ahead, walking in supernatural strength, wisdom, and authority. I thought my journey into the afterlife had ended, but God had one more revelation for me. 3 months later, during a time of extended fasting and prayer, something unexpected happened. I was in my bedroom, kneeling in prayer, seeking God with all my heart. The past months had been filled with sharing my testimony, and I had seen many people begin to understand the power of fasting. But as I prayed that night, a strange sensation came over me. My heartbeat became irregular, and suddenly everything went dark. Later, I would learn that I had suffered an unexplained cardiac event, and that my heart had stopped beating for exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. But in those brief moments, I was once again transported into the realm of living light. The moment I arrived, I knew why I was there. Jesus stood before me, his presence as overwhelming as before. But this time, he carried a look of joyful anticipation. He spoke softly, yet his words carried weight. "Michael, I have brought you back to show you the fruit of what you have learned." Then in an instant, I saw a panoramic view of the earth. Everywhere, people were embracing fasting as a spiritual discipline. The same golden threads I had seen before were now multiplying, stretching across entire nations. Waves of revival were breaking out. People who had been bound in addiction were being set free. Prayers that once seemed powerless were now shaking the heavens. Jesus smiled and said, "Do you see? Fasting was never just about you. It was about my church. The seeds you planted are now bearing fruit." Tears filled my eyes as I realized fasting isn't just a personal practice. It's a movement that has the power to change lives, families, and entire generations. As I stood in the presence of Jesus, still overwhelmed by what I had seen, he looked at me with great seriousness and said, "The time ahead will require my people to walk in a level of spiritual authority they have never known before. Fasting is no longer optional. It is essential." At that moment, I saw glimpses of the future, and what I witnessed shook me to my core. There were challenges, trials, and intense spiritual battles unlike anything the world had seen. I saw waves of darkness trying to spread over nations, bringing confusion, division and oppression. Yet in the midst of it, I saw small pockets of intense light, groups of believers who had embraced the power of fasting and prayer. They were standing firm, resisting the darkness, holding back forces that would have otherwise overtaken entire cities. Jesus then showed me how fasting breaks chains in the spiritual realm. I saw people who had been bound by addictions, generational curses, and demonic oppression, and as they fasted, the chains began to weaken and then snap completely. Many of them had prayed for years without breakthrough, but it was their fasting that finally released them into freedom. Then I saw something that brought me to tears. I saw how fasting partners with Jesus' ongoing intercession. It was as if every act of fasting joined with his prayers in heaven, creating a powerful force that moved through the earth. Jesus smiled and said, "When my people fast with a pure heart, it moves my heart, not because they are earning my love, but because they are choosing to partner with me in ways they do not yet understand." At that moment, I knew beyond a doubt, fasting is not just a discipline. It is a divine invitation, an invitation to prepare, to partner with heaven, and to be ready for what is coming. As I stood before him, Jesus' eyes filled with both urgency and love. He spoke with a tenderness that pierced my soul, yet his words carried a weight of divine authority. "Michael, what I have shown you is not just for you, it is for my church. The hour is later than they realize, and my people must be prepared." I felt the intensity of his words deep within me. This was not just a personal revelation. It was a message that had to be shared with the world. Then he showed me one last vision. I saw millions of believers across the earth, standing at a crossroads. Some were awake, their eyes wide with understanding, ready to embrace fasting as a way to partner with God. Others, however, were asleep, unaware of the spiritual battle intensifying around them. The enemy was working tirelessly to keep them distracted, complacent, and unaware of the power they had access to. Jesus then said, "Tell them that I am calling my church back to biblical fasting, not as a religious duty, but as a necessity for the days ahead. The greatest outpouring of my Spirit is coming, but my people must be prepared to carry it." I then saw how fasting was creating spiritual lighthouses, individuals who, through their sacrifice, were pushing back darkness in their families, their communities, and even entire nations. Jesus emphasized again, "The power is not in the fasting itself, the power is in me. But fasting positions my people to receive what I am ready to release." As everything around me began to fade, Jesus gave me one final command. "Tell them that I am not calling them to fast to earn my love. They already have that completely. I am calling them to fast because I want to entrust them with my power. The darkness will grow, but through prayer and fasting, my light in them will shine brighter still." And then, just as suddenly as I had left, I was back in my body, forever changed, carrying a message that could not be ignored.